Greetings all and welcome to Lucas Brews. In today's video we'll be doing a full build and review of the Airfix 1/72nd scale Fw 190 A8 from 2019. As well as this being the first time I'll be airbrushing a German camouflage, this will also be a revisit to the kit I got 9 years ago when I was a kid of the F-8, and I'll be using some spare decals to do it in the winter scheme from the 2013 release. So without further ado, let's have a build of this kit. I start off by giving all the sprues a wash in some warm soapy water to remove any oil or residue from the parts which might prevent paint and glue from sticking to them, and then I begin cutting out the first few parts I need, which include the cockpit tub, pilot figure, instrument panel, fuselage halves, the exhausts, the engine, wings, and the cannons from the sprues. Once removed, I then cut off any excess sprue and sand away any seam lines or imperfections. The original Airfix F-8 kit came with 4 bombs for the underside of the wings, and although I could find the original 250kg bomb, I couldn't find any of the smaller ones, so I found a couple spare and used a needle to drill out the kit's attachment points and test fitted the bombs. The F-8s had their outer cannons removed, so before installing the outer wing panels, I cut away and sanded off the ejector port and then glued them into place. The final modification to the underside of the wings was to drill out the holes for the centre rack, which I'll put the kit's original 250kg bomb onto. The 2 lower exhausts were then glued to the lower wing, and then I glued the cannons to the wheel well and the base of the outer cannon to the wings after the barrel had been removed. I installed the seat, joystick and rudder pedals, which I had to cut out and clean up, along with the main instrument panel to the cockpit tub. After I glued the main exhaust to one of the fuselage halves, I then prepared the interior parts for painting by using some Vallejo gloss black primer thinned with 1 part thinner to 3 parts primer. I sprayed several light passes over the side walls, the wheel wells, the cockpit tub, the engine and the pilot, who I mounted on a cocktail stick. I let the primer cure overnight, and the next day I painted highlights onto the various raised surfaces of these parts using some Vallejo Model Air Insignia White. I got a lot of spider webbing, which means that the paint must have been a little bit too thin, and I also found I seemed to have a lot of dry pigments build up, which would then cause blockages. I found that using Model Color Flat White is a bit better than the Model Air Insignia White. Once dried, which being acrylics didn't take too long, I then sprayed all of the cockpit area parts with Vallejo Model Air RLM 66, and for the cockpit mixed a ratio of 1 part paint to 1 part thinners. I then painted the interior of the wheel wells with some Vallejo Model Air RLM 02, which was applied using the same ratio. The engine was painted in Vallejo Model Air Aluminium, which used the same ratio as well. With the base colours down, I then used a very fine SMS paintbrush to paint the raised sidewall details using Vallejo Model Color Flat Yellow, Vallejo Model Color Vermilion Red, and Vallejo Model Color Flat Black. The flat black was also used to paint the joystick, main instrument panel, cannon assembly and the engine gearbox. A tiny dab of Model Air Aluminium was applied onto the rudder pedals and the joystick buttons, while some Vallejo Model Air gunmetal was used to paint the inside of the cannon barrels. To add some interior metal chipping, I apply some Tamiya XF16 onto a brush, and after removing the excess, I dab it onto the seat and along some of the raised areas in the cockpit and landing gear bay. Annoyingly, I forgot to airbrush some of the wheel well details that are moulded to the upper wings, so I decided to brush paint them instead with the Model Air RLM02, though being designed for airbrushing, this rather thin paint took quite a few coats until it was nice and solid. RLM02 was also applied to the inside walls of the engine. Once the upper wing details had had a few coats, I glued the 2 wing halves and clamped them together using some bulldog clips. Unfortunately, there was a bit of a gap between the 2 wing halves, which I believe might be because of the cannon barrels. The cockpit tub was then glued to the left fuselage side, and before adding the right side, I applied some Tamiya black panel accent over the entirety of the interior, along with the engine and wheel wells to help highlight their recessed details and give them a bit of a grimy appearance. The excess wash was then removed using a cotton bud and some enamel thinners, which also helped it flow more into just the recesses. There are no moulded details on the instrument panel, but decals are included, which I stuck in some warm water and then slid onto the instrument panel part and applied some Tamiya decal adhesive over the top of them to help them stick. And with the cockpit done, I glued the fuselage halves together and clamped them as well before adding the engine, which didn't really fit very well. The lower wing had a lot of flash and excess plastic where it met the rear fuselage, which I then had to sand before gluing it to the underside of the fuselage. While the wings and fuselage bonded, I cut out the two parts for the upper cowling, the horizontal stabilizers, the stepladder, which I would not attach until later on, and the rudder. Unfortunately, while handling the model, I damaged one of the cannon barrels and the pitot tube that's moulded to one of the wings. I managed to locate and reattach the cannon barrel, but unfortunately I lost the pitot tube and would have to find a replacement later on. The rudder was then glued into place, followed by the two horizontal stabilizers and the engine cowling. The rudder and stabilizers fitted perfectly into place, but unfortunately the cowlings would require a fair bit of sanding and fiddling to manage a good fit. I had to remove the engine piece from the fuselage though, as I forgot to add the cowling fan and washer before gluing the engine in place so that the prop would spin. Once locked into the engine by the washer, I then glued the engine back to the fuselage and attached the cowlings. With most of the assembly completed for the aircraft, I decided to begin masking off the wheel wells using some blue tack to fit the retracted gear parts into place. To prepare the rest of the model for priming, I filled in any gaps with Vallejo water-based putty using a cocktail stick, and once the putty was applied, I removed the excess using a damp finger. There were quite a few bad gaps, especially around the cowling and along the wing seams, and where the lower wing meets the fuselage. I then let the putty dry overnight, and the next day sanded away the excess using a nail file and some very fine sandpaper. I also sanded down the seam line between the fuselage halves. Any panel lines that were lost were carefully rescored using a knife, and with that done, I masked the engine and cockpit using some white tack, and for the rear fuselage area I used some Tamiya masking tape, and with that, the model was ready for priming. Before priming the model, I first blasted it with 40 psi of air from the compressor to remove any leftover sanding particles that might be stuck to the model. Once done, I mixed up 2 drops of Vallejo Flow Improver, 8 drops of acrylic thinners, and 24 drops of Vallejo Gloss Black Primer. This would be a lot more than needed, but I was priming a few aircraft at once. I mixed them in using some backwash, and then proceeded to prime the model, building it up gradually using one wing as a handle, and once the primer was touch dry, I then held onto another part of the model and finished the wing that I was holding onto. I found that the gloss primer went on really easily with no issues, apart from my compressor constantly spitting water. Despite my air compressor having a water trap at the base, I find that it quite regularly seems to fill up with water and start spitting. I did manage to reduce how much this happens by moving my compressor off of the floor and onto a windowsill above my workspace, so maybe it's something to do with gravity, or maybe cooling. Either way though, it's an issue I face with this and some of my early builds, but I've seemed to have managed to reduce it to the point where I'm at least not having water get sprayed all over the model while I'm trying to paint it. For this model, I decided to try and paint the yellow and red markings on the fuselage and nose before painting the camouflage, so that there wouldn't be a clear line that was above the other layer that looked a little bit unrealistic. I started with the yellow band first, using 1 drop of Flow Improver, 1 drop of thinner, and 4 drops of Vallejo Model Air RLM4 Yellow. I've heard to avoid clogging it's best to add the thinners before the paints, so I did this with every colour I sprayed. One thing though I wish I'd done was mask the yellow and red before applying it, even though it was onto primer, because it would later on discolour future layers. For the nose area, I mixed 1 drop of Flow Improver, 5 drops of acrylic thinner, and 4 drops of model colour Vermilion Red. I had a few blocked tips though, and added 2 extra drops of acrylic Flow Improver, and this seemed to make it a lot better. Interestingly, I've seen this scheme interpreted as blue rather than red by Eduard, but I decided to stick with red since that was the colour of the decals and the original Airfix markings, plus I honestly think the red looks a lot better. After the red had dried, I applied some masking tape to protect it and the yellow band from the camouflage layers. I found it tricky even with the 3mm masking tape though for the curved cowling, but the yellow bands on the fuselage were pretty easy to apply. To paint the camouflage, I first apply the lighter underside colour mixing 2 drops of a Vallejo Flow Improver, 6 drops of AK acrylic thinners, and 6 drops of AK Interactive's RLM76 Variation 1. I found the paint splattered a lot though, so I added 6 drops of thinners, which improved things, but now was showing speckles. I then tried adding 6 drops of Flow Improver to slow the drying a little, and added 3 more drops of paint, and this was much better. To create a subtle pre-shading effect, I decided to try filling in the middle of each panel, and then I would later unify the surface with a few layers. Overall, I found the AK RLM76 to be very pleasant and easy to apply and clean up, and it produced a pretty nice result despite my inexperience. I did however find that the yellow and red overspray led to a fair bit of discoloration since the 76 was rather light and it was being applied over the gloss black, which contrasted quite heavily. This meant I had to apply some extra layers to get the final colour to be more uniform, which wasn't really ideal. Once I was happy though with the RLM76 and it looked pretty uniform, I used a thin strip of 3mm masking tape to achieve a clean line between the wings and horizontal stabilizers, and the RLM76 on the fuselage, which was based on reference photos. I also applied tape to the entire underside of the model to prevent any overspray of the darker surfaces, especially while painting the wings. For the upper surface, I begin with the lightest of the 2 camouflage colours, which would be RLM75. I mixed up 2 drops of Vallejo Flow Improver, 6 drops of AK Thinner, and 4 drops of AK Interactive RLM75, and then began to apply the paint. The 190 scheme I was doing seemed to have very soft edges on the camouflage, which seems pretty consistent based on reference photos. So I sprayed each area of the camouflage, filling in the shape, and doing several light passes. Fortunately, with the winter camouflage, I'd be able to hide most of the mistakes, but I found it very relaxing and good practice for getting control with the airbrush doing this scheme. I found it was best to make the outline of each camo shape and then fill it in, which was very similar to how I would brush paint. While doing the camouflage on the upper surface, I regularly checked the flow on some paper to make sure I was applying it smoothly, and for the first time airbrushing camo, I felt like I got a pretty decent result. Once the paint was dry, which only took about 15 minutes, I then mixed the same ratio of 2 parts Flow Improver, 6 part thinner, and 6 drops of AK Interactive RLM74, and began filling in the black varnish on the upper surface of the wings and the fuselage, creating the darker camouflage shapes. I was surprised though to find that the contrast was a lot softer between the lighter 75 and darker 74, especially after the paints had dried. This was interesting, as normally they seem to have a higher contrast when brush painting, which I believe would be a bit more accurate to how they look in real life. I had a bit of trouble painting the upper fuselage camouflage though, and had to very carefully remove some masking tape around the tail to add the markings. To see if I could improve the contrast and fix up any mistakes I'd made with shapes, I added another coat of the lighter RLM75, and I did find that this made it a bit lighter and added a more noticeable difference between the 2 colours. Fortunately for me, this scheme appears to have had no modelling on the sides, so after the RLM75 was dry, I removed the masking tape from the wings and fuselage, which to my delight worked well, although I found that there was a subtle amount of overspray on the fuselage sides, which meant that the masking tape lines near the tail and wing root were clearly visible. To fix this, I decided to spray a thin layer of RLM76, using a sheet of paper to mask off the wings. Doing this helped to blend and remove the visible overspray marks, and it also helped to fix up any mistakes and neaten up the edges of the fuselage camo. I gave the paint a few hours to dry and fully cure before I then mixed 3 drops of Vallejo acrylic thinner with 5 drops of Vallejo gloss varnish and applied it over the entire aircraft. This gloss varnish would help to protect the vulnerable acrylic paints from scratching and also provide a smooth glossy surface for the decals to apply to, which helps to prevent any silvering. The varnish was then given 12 hours to fully cure, and once dry I then moved on to applying the decals. I start with the main decals by placing the ones I need in some warm water, and once they come loose of the transfer paper, I place them onto the model using a brush or my finger. I had to use some spare decals to do this scheme, which unfortunately were a little bit old and of mediocre quality. With a bit of patience, I managed to unfold and smooth out most of the decals, although there is still a bit of an imperfection on the left side fuselage cross. I still had the original red 2 and yellow V from the first Airfix 190 I bought, but the rest of the decals were either from this kit, or spares from an IBG 190 and a Revell Heinkel 219. Once all the main decals were applied, I then used a cotton bud to apply some Vallejo decal softener to all of the decals, followed by some Tamiya decal adhesive, which would help the decals to stick to the model and also conform into all of the recessed details. I then applied all of the common stencils from the kit, which were applied in the same fashion, and then given the Vallejo softener and decal adhesive. As normal for Airfix decals, the common markings went on well with no issues, and are quite nicely detailed. I gave the decals 12 hours to settle, and in the meantime I cut out the canopy segments for the bubble type variant based on references, cleaned up the clear parts of flash with a knife, and masked up the canopy using a mix of 3mm masking tape for the frame edges, which was pushed down with a cocktail stick, and some Vallejo liquid mask for the middle sections. The Vallejo liquid mask dries really quickly, so once that was done, I fixed the canopies to my turntable using some blue tack, which would also help to mask off the insides of them, and then applied some Vallejo Model Air RLM66 to give the canopy framework its interior colour. This was then followed by some light coats of the AK Interactive RLM75. I was also working on the Eduard and Tamiya 190 kits I've previously done inbox reviews of, so I painted their canopies at the same time. Although I found this process pretty easy for the main and rather curvy canopy sections, I decided to just hand paint the fine framework on the smaller front windshield by using a brush and the same colours. Once the paint was dry, I removed any excess from the edges of the windshield canopy using a cocktail stick. Moving on to the metal chipping, I applied a small amount of Vallejo Model Air aluminium onto a fine brush, and after removing most of the wet paint and excess, I then gently dabbed it onto the areas of the aircraft that I wanted to create some metal chipping. This was focused on the leading edges of surfaces exposed to air resistance, along the wing route where crew would walk, along the edges of access hatches, and around the canopy. Normally, I would apply matte varnish first to protect the decals from weathering, and then apply the chipping, but since I was doing a winter camouflage scheme, I decided to do the chipping first, then do the winter camo and apply matte varnish last. Unfortunately though, I would damage some of the decals while painting, so I won't be doing it this way in the future. For the winter camouflage, I mixed up 6 drops of Vallejo Flu Improver, 6 drops of Vallejo Acrylic Thinners, and 8 drops of Vallejo Mortal Color Flat White. After a little bit of backwashing and mixing, and a few test sprays, I began to create all of the line pattern based on my marking guide, which I downloaded from ScaleMates. In hindsight, I probably could have used less thinner and more flow improver to get more precise and finer lines with a bit more paint, but I was pretty pleased with most of the winter camouflage and was able to make solid enough lines by doing a few passes when required. I was aiming for a rather messy and slightly transparent appearance though for the white, as it would have been a rush job done in the field. Unfortunately though, I got a bit too close a few times and experienced some spluttering, and I also suffered from some tip drying issues. I found it gradually got worse as I continued to apply the white lines, so I decided to clean the tip and mix up another fresh amount of 5 drops of flow improver, 2 drops of acrylic thinners, and 3 drops of model color white to do the fuselage. Although it was very scary and I did damage some of the wing walkway markings and had those splutters, I was still really happy with the results and I had a lot of fun trying this technique out. I definitely feel like I got a little bit more practice with controlling the airbrush, and in future builds I will definitely be varnishing over my decals before applying any airbrushing over the top of them in the future. With all of the airbrush painting completed, I removed the retracted landing gear parts which I'd used as a mask and began to cut out the actual landing gear parts, headrest and the propeller. I then sanded the parts with a metal and nail file to remove the seam lines and any excess sprue. The prop was then glued to the cowling fan, followed by the spinner, and after some light sanding, I attached the tail wheel. One criticism of this kit I've heard is that the landing gear struts are moulded extended as if there was no weight on the aircraft, so since my FW would be bombed up, I decided to attempt cutting a segment out and then gluing them in place slightly more compressed. But I found that they were very fragile, and since the F-8 I was doing had the bottom part of the wheel covers removed to prevent mud and snow from jamming up the wheels, they weren't really there to support the struts. As a result, I decided to instead use some spares from another kit so that they weren't so delicate and just leave them in the extended position. I then glued the wheels and modified landing gear doors to each strut and added them onto the wings. Once they're in place, I added the smaller struts which are inside the wheel wells and added the stepladder for the pilot in the extended position. The pesky cannon barrels and a replacement pitot tube were glued back onto the wings, and after some sanding, the main bomb was glued to the centre rack and the 4 smaller bombs were added to the outer wings. To paint these added parts and details, I switched back to brush painting and painted the propeller and bombs with AK Interactive's RLM70, the tail wheel, main wheels and cooling fan with Vallejo model colour flat black, and then applied several coats of these different colours to make them nice and solid. For the landing gear struts and tail wheels, I used Vallejo Model Air RLM02, although this being an airbrush paint is very thin, so I am considering getting Vallejo Model Colour RLM2. And for the outside of the landing gear doors and the stepladder, I applied a few coats of AK RLM76 Variation 1, which I'd used on the underside of the aircraft. After a few more touch-ups of these colours, I then painted the cannon and machine gun barrels with Vallejo Model Air Gunmetal Metallic. The hub of the tail wheel was very carefully painted with Vallejo Model Air Aluminium, and then I very carefully painted the white spiral on the propeller. Although a decal is included for the spiral, I always find it easier to paint them on with German aircraft. Any mistakes on the tail wheel were then fixed up with some flat black, and RLM70 was used to touch up the propeller spiral before I finished the white again with another coat, and finally sprayed the model in a coat of matte varnish to protect the winter camo, finer details and the decals. I used 2 drops of flow improver, 5 drops of thinners, and 5 drops of matte varnish, which seemed to work quite well applied in a few light passes. The matte varnish blended and protected the layers very nicely, but took away the shine of the gunmetal on the cannons, so I had to apply another coat. I also used the gunmetal to paint the exhaust heat shields on the sides of the fuselage. To paint the nav lights and the bare metal parts on the wheel struts, I used Vallejo Model Air RLM01 Silver, and to add some subtle metal chipping to the propeller blades and wheel hubs, I dry brushed a bit of the Vallejo Model Air Aluminium. I finally unmasked the canopy and found the liquid and Tamiya masks worked perfectly, although I still did find a tiny bit of cleanup on the edges was necessary using a cocktail stick. I painted the headrest with several coats of RLM66 grey, and then the glare shield and the tiny gun sight with some model colour flat black. To paint the padding that's on the gun sight and the trim on the glare shield, I used a tiny bit of Vallejo model colour saddle brown, applied in 2 layers, and then I picked out the reflector sight with RLM01 silver. Satisfied with the paint on the gun sight, I then cut it out carefully using a knife and attempted to glue it to the glare shield, only to find it didn't really fit, as it was supposed to be installed before the fuselage halves were joined. I did manage to get it into place eventually, but it took a little bit of cutting down. To give the wheel hubs a gloss finish on the centre, I applied some gloss varnish using a fine brush, and then used flat black to touch up the glare shield and paint the headrest. After the warning decal on the back of the headrest has been applied, I then carefully glued it to the main canopy section. The front windshield was then sanded down slightly so that it would fit, and then I carefully applied some Revell Contactor Professional to the base and glued it to the glare shield. Usually though I'd use some Rocket Odorless CA glue, but at the time I was out. A little bit of vermilion red was used to apply the markings to the stepladder, and also some small marks on the wheels based on reference photos, before I then moved on to adding some more weathering. First of all, to add some grime effects, as well as highlight the details and create a post-shading effect, I used some Tamiya Black Panel Ascent, applying it over the various recessed panel lines, especially around the engine, the control surfaces, on the underside of the wings, and very heavily on and around the landing gear, which often get dirty and leak a little bit of oil. To add some variety, I mixed in some brown panel line accent, especially around the wheels and upper surface, to simulate a little bit of dirt, and around the underside engine to add some variation from various oil stains. The effect is pretty strong, so to remove the excess, help the panel liner flow more into just the gaps, and also create a subtle streaking effect, I use a cotton bud dipped in some X20 enamel thinners to drag away the excess panel liner. In some tighter areas I would use a fine brush as required. I continued to work away the excess wash until I'd created a more subtle appearance that I was happy with. For some of the heavier effects, I use some of Tamiya's water-activated weathering powders. I apply the black pigment heavily around the exhausts and streak it backwards based on reference photos, and as the pigments dry, I remove the excess and soften the edges of the exhaust streaking using a damp brush dipped in some water to rub away the excess. Black pigments were also applied streaking backwards around the wheel well, the control hinges, ejector ports for the shell casings, the muzzles, and the cowling for some oil streaks, grime, and gun smoke. I decided to experiment by using the white pigments to create a build-up of snow effect by applying it into the ruts of the wheels, and finally to add some dried dirt and mud splatters on the sides of the aircraft from it operating out of dirt strips. I dabbed some of the rust-coloured pigment onto the wheels, landing gear doors, the ladder, walkway, the base of the rudder near the tail wheel, and on the underside of the wings. Once again, water could then be used to streak and remove the excess after it had been applied. I also had some Vallejo environment snow effects, so I decided to apply a bit to add some extra snow build-up on the wheels, as if a small amount had built up on them. I probably should have double-checked reference photos at the time, but it was quite a fun technique, and I was quite happy with how it looked. On pretty much all of my aircraft, I like to have the option to add or remove a pilot, so I used blue tack to hold the canopy in place instead of gluing it, and once it was in position, I created the rigging wire by using AK Interactive's ultra-thin rigging wire and some super glue. I glued the wire first to the canopy, then stretched it back, glued it to the tail, cut away the excess rigging wire, and then added the smaller line from the tail to the fuselage sides. By this stage, the silver had dried on the nav lights, so I then added their colour using some Tamiya clear red for the left side and clear green for the right one. And finally, after painting the control tabs on the aircraft with vermilion red, my Airfix Fw190 F-8 was finally completed. And here you can see the results I achieved with this model. So I think it's safe to say over the years my FW190 builds have been steadily improving, and I have to say I'm very happy with how this one turned out. It has definitely been a learning experience with this one, especially using the airbrush for the first time to do a German and a winter camouflage scheme, but also a lot of fun, and I think it went really well. A few people have already been sharing some great advice for how I can improve my airbrushing techniques, which is really appreciated. In my Tamiya and Eduard 190 builds I'm currently working on, I've already started to adjust how I've applied the base colours, and I've also done some further experimenting using aluminium as a base colour rather than just applying the camouflage over the gloss black. And I've also adjusted how I've been masking off the yellow markings on the underside of the aircraft and the fuselage bands more effectively. In the future, I'm planning on doing a winter diorama base and also painting the pilot figure included in this kit, so if you guys want to see that as a future video, definitely let me know in the comments. The Airfix 190 has a couple of fiddly steps and some fit issues and parts that require some sanding, especially around the cowling, but in my opinion it's still a pretty easy, accurate and enjoyable build with some nice details. I've built it a few times over the years, and it being the first World War II single-engine prop kit I ever built makes it a bit of a nostalgic one for me. So admittedly, I am probably a bit biased, and I apologise to all those who started out their modelling careers on Spitfires. Although the Edgeward kit is definitely more detailed and has a lot more options for marking and variants, and I will be covering that in a future build video, I would still recommend having a build of this Airfix one, especially if you're a beginner or just want a simpler 190 build in 1/72 scale. Just make sure you spend some time sanding the cowling parts, do a little bit of test fitting, and you should have a good time with this kit. Thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please be sure to leave a like and also subscribe to the channel to help things out. A big shout out, as always, to my wonderful patrons for helping me to fund not only buying these kits, but also the products I use to make them, and the airbrushing setup which I recently got for doing these videos. I'll leave a link in the description for anyone who wants to join to not only help support the channel, but also get early access to my videos ad-free, get some discounts on my cults page, extra voting powers in upcoming votes and polls on YouTube, and exclusive content. I apologise for this one being a little bit late, as I was originally intending to have this full uncut version available for last weekend, but I was a little bit unwell in the days leading up to it, and I also had some family stuff on, but the video's here now, and there'll be some more coming later this week, so stay tuned for those. Otherwise though, thanks again, and until the next video, as always, take care, and model on.